Okay. Well, I'm Benjamin Boyce. I produce content on YouTube and podcasts, specifically around investigative journalism and deep dive interviews with a range of intellectuals and individuals that I find interesting.
Hello and welcome to Spokes. In this episode, I'm talking to Benjamin Boyce. We're in lockdown, so we're socially distancing. I'm in Ireland and Benjamin is in the northwest of America, somewhere in Washington state. It's 6 o'clock in the evening here on a sunny May evening, and it's 10 o'clock in the morning there. I don't know what the weather is like. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about the student protests at Evergreen State College, which is in Washington State, and they took place or hit the main headlines in 2017. We also address the right-wing question. We look at ideas about activism, oppression, microaggressions, religious cults, gender, race, privilege politics, and more. If you have a listen, see what you think, and if you like it, you can check out more of Benjamin's work on his YouTube channel, Benjamin A. Boyce. I have been binge watching your videos this week.
Oh, I hope you're not you're getting a little deleterious in the brain from all that exposure.
Oh, they're so great. And so educational. I mean, I did watch some of your videos and I listen to your podcast normally on my podcast app. So, so from looking at your YouTube channel, you have like 500 videos. You've got 8 million views and 43,000 subscribers. But one thing that really sticks out is the emphasis on Evergreen State College. So what can you tell us about your fascination with Evergreen?
Well, what happened at the Evergreen State College was in 2017 it kind of began in May of 2017, so about 3 years ago, and we just celebrated the 3-year anniversary of a particular event in this chain of events. But what happened was that the students, well, a portion of the students, a percentage of the students decided to protest matters of racism, systemic racism on campus. And their protest was live streamed onto the internet, and the way in which they behaved during the protest raised a lot of eyebrows and turned a lot of heads. And it seemed kind of like a train wreck of a situation because the way in which the protesters were behaving was rather extreme, from staging what you could think of as struggle sessions, which is a reference to the communist revolution in China, where students berated their teachers and performed these like witch hunty kind of pillories of their professors by just lambasting them and degrading them publicly and getting a lot of pleasure out of that. That was one set of the protest activity. And then there was a library blockade where the students rounded up teachers and took administration hostage and presented this list of demands, which was really, well, you go through the list of demands and you're like, well, why are you protesting? What is really going on here? They targeted one professor in particular, Brett Weinstein, and accused him of being racist and used emails that he had written to other professors and the administration as proof of his racism. But if you read those emails, it's really difficult. Any reasonable person is going to find it really difficult to find racism in those things. I was a student at the time that this happened. I was on campus while this protests were going on, which will eventually get to answer your question. But just one anecdote was that I was working in the library at my job there in the media department, which will also work into the story later on. And one of my classmates who was pro-protester, or one of the protesters who was my classmate, came up to me with a stack of Brett Weinstein's emails and said, I know he's a racist. And I'm looking at these emails, but it's really difficult to find the racism. He's really good at hiding his racism. He's coded it, and we're trying to decode it. I'm like, okay, well, maybe it's not there, But such was the state at the time of certain very loud vocal contingent of the college, which the administration empowered by coddling and catering to, took over the campus, took over the mindset of the campus, had basically full control of the campus. And I watched that happen. I was there. I found it really ridiculous. And then a few days after the protest proper, one of my professors allowed another struggle session to occur where students of color, which is their term, berated and pilloried white students, which I guess is all of our term, based on their skin color, and said, your white silence is violence. And when us white students were like, well, what do you want us to say? We were told to shut the fuck up, quote unquote. Sorry to introduce that word to your viewership. Feel
free to use that word, yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
There's a few things I want to talk about there. So first of all, you mentioned Brett Weinstein, and I'm a fan of Brett and his wife, Heather Hying. Don't know if I'm pronouncing their name right.
I think you are.
Okay, so, but I mentioned them in a conversation I had about 1 year ago maybe, and somebody said they're right wing. And then when I said that you were coming on the podcast, somebody who's researching right-wing groups in Ireland was recommended to listen to it afterwards. So I want to just clear that issue out of the way of your political leanings or, views.
Well,
and then we get back to Evergreen.
Okay, well, how do you frame that question then? Am I right-wing? And what does that mean to be right-wing? What does that allow your readers to do, or your listeners to do right off the bat? Oh, this is a right-wing person. So everything that he says is going to be framed in a certain direction, or I can interpret everything he says in a certain direction. And assumably completely discount the story. So if we talk about the story and then we talk about the interpretation of the story, then we can get into questions of whether or not I have an appreciation for conservative thought and if I have an appreciation for progressive thought. I do not think of myself as one way or another. I agree with certain aspects of a variety of political ideologies and thoughts, but I try to assemble my own. And furthermore, I attempt in my own product to maintain a certain level of distance from my own opinion in order for me to engage in authentic discourse with people in various different places on the spectrum. One thing that I can say that I really disapprove of is leftists disregarding anything that is so-called right-wing. I think that's a bullshit, low-resolution maneuver, and it's a tactic used by cowards and people who do not trust even their own intelligence to engage in a thoughtful manner with a different person.
Absolutely agree. Right, so we've got that out of the way, so I want to get back to Evergreen.
Well, one more note. The Evergreen, what we're going to discuss about is very uncomfortable for people of a progressive leaning to look at. And they do themselves a disservice by not really carefully considering what happened, because the ideas that motivated and sheltered the behavior that we see at the Evergreen protests are very decidedly left-wing ideas. So this is, even if you are a left-wing person, you need to understand that your ideas can be abused. And this is one way in which these ideas were abused and used to affect very ignoble, very backwards behaviors.
Okay, they're quite strong words to say that they're actually being abused. So what were the kind of key elements of it? I mean, I have so many questions for you. I'd like to also ask about what was your trajectory of change throughout the process? Like, did your ideas stay the same?
Did my ideas stay the same? Well, my main trajectory of change has been within the skill set of being a communicator, and then being able to perform thinking out loud have changed a lot. Since I began producing content about Evergreen, my exposure to an audience has changed the way in which I present and convey thought and interact with things, which I think is a bigger change than what I actually think about things. Because I don't know if I actually have stable convictions of political leaning. I don't trust communist thought. I have a hard time like making sense of it. It's easier for me to understand capitalist thought, and it's easier for me to appreciate conservatism on a traditional level. And and yet at the same time, being an artist, being a creative, I'm always playing with new ideas or wanting to engage, to manipulate traditions in order to produce something that possibly could be better. But I have and this is a byproduct of me just aging. I'm kind of entering into my mid-40s now. I have more and more appreciation for the tried and true tested ideas that have been handed down to me through my culture. And I'm less propelled from the inside to rebel against ideas that I don't fully understand, that have been around for a long time. So that's a way of not answering your question. But
well, can I just ask it? Like at the beginning, I watched the series of 20 videos on Evergreen, the complete Evergreen, I think it's called, is it? The playlist. And like you track the beginnings back a few years before that, like back to 2015.
Yeah.
So in 2015 compared to June 2017.
Yeah. How did I change?
How did you change? And your views of the ideas, like you talked about in another video.
Yeah.
Was it like oppression training, anti-oppression training, I think it was called, something like that.
Yeah.
So were you supportive of that kind of training and outlook at the outset, and did that change?
I'm always distrustful of new ideas. I'm always skeptical of new ideas. And there's this, I think it's a Jewish aphorism, but I heard it from Northrop Frye, who was a Canadian literary professor, where the fool is a man with a new idea that turns out to be an old fallacy, right? And a lot of what I heard at Evergreen it sounds new. They would talk about equity, and it's not equality. And they tie their ideas to the civil rights movement, but then they would use these new terms like anti-racism, anti-oppression. Well, what do you mean by that? And I've always held skepticism towards activism, specifically, seeing the trajectory of 60s activism kind of devolve into, a bunch of idealism for the boomer generation, turning into a bunch of practicality, which turns into the 80s, which is just, let's just make money. And, eventually the trajectory of idealism is that it meets with and compromises to a greater or lesser degree with practicality. So by which I mean that just the framing of their ideas as anti-oppression, I have a problem with. If I set up my entire ideology as against another ideology, I won't be able to move beyond oppression. I will need to find more and more oppression in order to validate my belief system and my activism. And what you see very definitely with anti-racism, anti-racist thought, or anti-oppressive thought, is that the big ideas or the big changes of the civil rights movement had been affected and led to smaller and smaller injustices, right? The bigger injustices were broken down and turned into smaller injustices. And you still need to work on, let's say, alleviating the outcomes of racist laws in the past. You still need to promote not anti-discrimination, but promote understanding between different racial groups, promote understanding between, let's say, straight people and LGBT people, right? You need to promote an understanding of otherness and a decrease in discrimination. But within the college campus climate that I was in, you had this invention of the microaggression, right? So the microaggression is now de-seeding that systemic oppression of, let's say, Jim Crow laws, or laws that would segregate black people and cause a disparity in the access to resources between whites and blacks. So you have these major discretions being replaced with micro aggressions. But the activist tenor and the urgency and the necessity to change, it doesn't change pitch, right? So you have a decreasing in the aggression or the oppression, but you don't have a decreasing in the pitch of protest. And my question is, can you actually engage with the nuances of microaggressions if you don't care, if you don't tone down your rhetoric and tone down your vehemence, your virulence, to be proportionate with what you're dealing with? Somebody not looking at you in the right way, or somebody saying something that can be construed as offensive, right? So oppression was replaced with offense, right? Which is a lesser form of oppression, but the reaction to oppression maintained the same tenor. And so I disagree with that. I just don't think that results in anything other than what happened at Evergreen. The students were handed all of this rhetoric, and I have footage of one of the administrators who's putting a lot of revolutionary ideas into the heads of the students. He's showing all these photos from 1957 from black protesters being harassed by white police officers, being chased down by dogs. He's showing all these images to the students, and then he's saying, this hasn't changed at all. This is the same thing that's happening right now. It's just they've gone passive aggressive now. Like these institutions are still against you in the same way. So you need to figure out how they're actually that way. And then he promotes like these revolutions in the Caribbean about like people taking over the island. Like the queens of the island rose up and overthrow their oppressors. And then 80 days later, the people that he's talking to enact an overthrow of the so-called racist overlords who are bending over backwards. The administration is bending over backwards to facilitate and to serve the people that are now accusing it of being racist.
Right. And I did notice that actually the word that kept on coming into my head when I saw George Bridges, the president at the time, was obsequious. Like he was just like, so like servile. Put your hands down. He's like, oh, I'm sorry, I have my hands up. And, they said jump. He would kind of say like, how high?
Yeah.
But so from the beginning, then you were quite critical. You had independent thought in a way that maybe the other students didn't have. You were a mature student, am I right in thinking?
Yeah, I was my immaturity is of a different caliber than their immaturity. Let's say I'm 16 to 18 years older than most of the people that are going to school there. I went to school, and Evergreen still serves older students quite a lot. And its model of education, I argue, is better suited to an older, more independent-minded student than it is to somebody who gets really low grades, doesn't really understand high school, and doesn't really understand that you need to put work into something in order to get something out of it, right? And a lot of the rhetoric that you see the protesters using is that the college is here to serve us. The college needs to fire who we find uncomfortable. The college needs to give us free grades, that needs to give us free food. It needs to serve us because we are paying it. And therefore, it needs to return our investment with what we want, which is good grades, which doesn't make sense because they're not actually, the college is cheating the students if it just gives them good grades, because then the student leaves with a diploma that doesn't actually translate into a skill set. And there's plenty of evidence that I've explored in the way that the Evergreen professoriate broke down the connection between meritocracy, between the effort that you put into something and the value that you receive with regards to a credential. The credential only really matters insofar as you earned it on your own. But yeah, I was of a different mindset. I was, 16, a decade and a half older than the students. I was in my college years in the 90s, which was at the heyday of a previous incarnation of political correct culture that was not as intense and I guess, radical as it was during the 2010s, right? The 20 teens, where you see a lot of the social justice activism kind of come to a head in a lot of different ways. And we'll see what happens nowadays with everything changing on the fly. But yeah, so I wasn't just critical of the ideas. I was just trying to play out the ideas. Like I would go to these privilege workshops, and and they would want you. The giver of the workshop would want you to assign your privilege and say, okay, what are the privileges that I have, and what are the privileges that I don't have, and then you enter into a confession of that, and I would refuse to do that. It's not for me to expose other people to who I envy and who envies me. I'm not going to play that envy game. I'm not giving you the reins to my shame and my guilt. Those are internal compasses in order for me to assess my own behavior. I'm not handing that over to somebody who's giving a workshop on this stuff. So I would play out a longer run, like, okay, if we all assign privilege to each other, what's the end game? What is the end game of doing this? And leading up to the protests, there was more and more protests on campus. And I would say to faculty, to the administration, I wrote a letter to George Bridges. I spoke with my overseers, my bosses in the college, and saying, you're teaching this privilege stuff, and it's resulting in these students acting without any sort of self-responsibility. These ideas are translating into this behavior. The behavior is wrong, therefore maybe either the ideas or the way that the ideas are presented, there's something wrong with them. And there's a complete disconnect. There was a complete disconnect, which is really frustrating to me.
And did people listen to you? Did other students listen to you? Did faculty members listen to you?
Okay, so people would agree with me and people would disagree with me, but I was a very small voice. Like, I was just one student. And plus, just watching it, I was kind of, the climate on the campus caused me to speak out less and less. So I would do slighter and slighter rebellions. Like when, for instance, instead of just arguing against the concept of privilege or arguing against why everybody should confess their pronouns and why I should assign myself a pronoun, instead of arguing that, I would just not do it. I would just not do it because they can't make me do it, and they're not going to shame me to do it. I would find little ways to protest in a way that you can't really call me out on. Like, it's like a microaggression in a way against a micro rebellion, let's say, against that climate. But the climate was very strong. It was from all quarters, and you could feel. Furthermore, I was exposed to a cult, a Christian cult, in a religious sense when I was in my formative years, and we left that when I was 5. So I wasn't really cognizant of the cult, but it had a very strong effect in my parents. And then I was always very wary when we go to an pardon me. When we go to a new church, I was always very wary of authority and always very, very skeptical of any pastor that we would come across. I'd always be listening to the sermons and seeing where they would slip into certain sorts of controlling behaviors. And I always, being somebody who aspired to be a novelist for many years, I always wanted or knew that the biggest story that I could investigate would be to show the inner workings of a cult, right? Because I was always attenuated to that and always being wary of that, even though I agree with a lot of the necessity for cultures to have a church or have a religion and have a religious institution. There's a variety of ways that those institutions can go awry. The thing is that secular societies have churches too. They just don't call them churches. And a lot of the social justice progressivism is a rebooted Christianity, but only the bad parts of Christianity. It's not a full story. They have all the sin, but zero redemption, right? So they have original sin in the form of privilege and systemic oppression. But how do you actually perform that? Like, how do you work that out? There's no way to be forgiven of my whiteness or my masculinity or my genitals, save that I bleach my or stain myself and cut off my genitals. There's no way for me to escape that inherent badness or that connection to that oppressive power structure. The only way to escape that is to submit myself to the anger of a mob. And what you see at the Evergreen State College protests is the enactment of the brokenness of this theology, where you have the white oppressors put on the pillory and just berated and berated and berated, and the president's giving them everything they want, is still not enough. It's still not enough. Okay, we're gonna call off the police. Oh yeah, but now we're unsafe. So what are you gonna do about our not safety? Well, I called off the police because you didn't want the police, but now you're unsafe. But now you want the police, and it doesn't make any sense. And the glee and the unhingedness of the play, of the morality play that you see in this footage is the acting out. It's the dramatic reenactment of a broken theology, right? There's no way out. It's incessant turmoil.
So does redemption come in some sense from being oppressed then?
Well, in a sense, you can think of, if you can find your oppression, and this might be a little too controversial to say, but you can see transgenderism in certain aspects. You can see white men figuring out how to get their oppression bucks back, right? In this system of oppression, you can see it happening, not in every case, and I've done a lot of research into the transgender issues and tried to platform a variety of views and show that there are reasonable trans people and reasonable people from all sides, but there is a contingent of the progressive oppression politic where you see people trying to figure out, where am I oppressed, because that gives me power. So there's no redemption, but there is power. There's no redemption, but there is power. And what do you actually use the power for? You use the power for, and I talked about this in one of my videos about Robin DiAngelo constructed this idea of white fragility. And she came to the Evergreen campus and gave talks about it and gave trainings to the teachers. And the teachers follow her theology by the letter, and they regurgitate her theology. So in a sense, her white fragility book is the little red book of the Evergreen Revolution, and that's another reference to the communist revolution. But I kind of lost my thought. But you see that if okay, let's just put it this way: if white people are privileged and black people are oppressed, then either you give all the power. How do you equalize that? How do you actually equalize that oppression? How do you fill those equity gaps or cause those equity gaps to be balanced out? One way is to build up the equity of the black people somehow. You build up their skill, you build up their money, build up their productive power. Or the other way to do it is to bring the white people down, right? It's much easier to bring the privileged people down than it is to raise up the oppressed. Because when you bring people down, it gives you the sense of equalization, right? It gives you the sense that we're all getting to the same level, because I'm now enacting all of the historical oppression on you in the moment. But it doesn't actually resolve anything. And that's why I argue, and if you listen to the rhetoric about equity, those who champion what they call equity constantly say it's not equality. We're not looking for equality. We're looking for equity, which means they want to equalize society. They want to bring everything to the same level. And it's much easier to tear down than it is to build up. It actually takes a lot more effort and planning and conscious thought to build everything up to the same level. But it takes like we're seeing right now, it takes very little effort and energy and forethought to burn everything to the ground.
Or to attempt to. I think what always interests me as well is that when you're talking about, or not you necessarily, but when there's a conversation about privilege, politics and privilege and oppression, that class rarely comes into it, or wealth. And, there's so many other things that don't actually come into it that aren't discussed. I know somebody once said, well, beauty doesn't come into it, or intelligence doesn't come into it. And, there's all of these other factors that aren't really considered. So that's really interesting about your own background then in it. I actually thought you went straight into college from school, and it was only when I was
preschool. I was working in preschool for about 15 years, and then I went to college.
I discovered all of that today. So I thought you were in your 20s, and then I realised, oh, well, not to give your age away, but I didn't even know you were a mature student until this afternoon.
Well, like I say, like my immaturity is a different form than the younger people's immaturity.
So you were there then during the events of, like, I think it really kicked off May 23rd. You were there for all of that. Were you in the college?
I don't think I was on campus for the 23rd, but I was on campus for the 24th. So the 23rd and the 24th are the two main days of protest. And what I've done in my complete Evergreen story is mapped out as thoroughly as possible the blow by blow, and then mixed in footage from the past and the present in order to give it context. But I was on campus when they took over the library building, and they blockaded doors, and they took over the administration building, and they rounded up people, and they went through and they checked if you work there or not. You're free to go if you didn't, or you were strongly questioned if you did work for the college, because they really thought that you needed to be in this room to enact equity.
So and you did work for the college as well
as a student employee. I worked in the media department, loaning equipment, working in the computer center, working on video editing and video production. Actually, I didn't take any classes in that, but that's what I ended up doing when I left Evergreen, is doing all the video stuff. And plus, that gave me access. Working in that department allowed me to experience firsthand a lot of the meetings and the rituals and the workshops that the professors were putting on, which is some insane stuff. I was on camera, like, just completely shocked. Like, wait, are they turning this into a church? Because if they are, it's a really bad church, and I don't think that's legal either, So it's like two levels of, like, bad quality and possibly illegal practices going on here. But I was there, and then I was able to locate those videos and then make them public by finding them where they were published on YouTube, and then going through the FOIAs. I have public records requests that are still 3 years old that they haven't gone through, because I knew all the words and all the people to ask. I have like a 20 gig just PDF document that they're going through and redacting all the students' names, and they've been working on it for 3 years now. I'm just pulling everything. And about a year ago.
Why? I mean, that's a question I did have here, but why are you putting so much time and effort and energy into this project?
Well, the short answer is because it's my nature. Maybe it's not my nature, but that's what I've done. So I went to Evergreen because I had written 20 novels, and they kept on breaking. At about 3/4 of the way through, the novel would collapse in on itself, and I'd write another one and it'd collapse in on itself, and then I'd rewrite, and it kept on doing it over and over and over again. And I just wanted to be a writer, and I saw that if I go to college, I can just focus for 4 years, just focus on literature and just really dive completely and full time plus into what I want to do, which is to tell a story. And I have had a story that is impossible to tell burning inside of me for years and years. An incredibly complex story that we don't need to get into, but it's a very significant story. It's like 7 novels long. It takes place in every level of literature, from mythology to folklore to the modern novel to the metafiction to science fiction, horror, all the different genres, all the different time periods. It's a super book, right? And that's what I poured myself into. So at my final year of Evergreen, I I finally got to the place where I could compose the book that I wanted to compose. And I spent a year of my time doing a lot of independent projects on this one novel. And I got to the end of the novel and I realized that my life was done. My life as a writer, like I felt it was kind of like this, something switched inside of my heart. Like I was standing in the shower one day and I just felt my ego, my writer ego die. Like, and I felt free. I'm like, oh, I'm done. Like, it doesn't matter if anybody ever reads that. I'm done. I've accomplished that. I'm done. What do I do now? And so I was kind of in this, leading up to the protest, I was kind of just plugging away with my writing and just really open to what's next for me. And when the protests happened, what I saw was that there was this website called YouTube. And on this website called YouTube, people were taking the footage of what was happening on the protests and making videos with the footage. And people were watching that footage just like crazy. Thousands and thousands of people were just watching this footage. And I was watching people break down that footage. And I was seeing that nobody actually knew what was going on. Nobody saw what was happening behind the scenes. I was there for the whole thing. And I started speaking about it. I'm like, okay, well, let's start talking about it. And people just started paying attention to me. It's like, oh, look at this weird guy in this basement of this school. And he's like breathing funny. And he's trying to talk like in my first Evergreen video, it really looks like I'm in this bomb shelter, just like leaning over the camera. And my presentation is really off. And
I watched that today. I thought it was great.
Oh, you saw that one?
June 17th.
Well, is it the 11th or the 7th?
June
11th.
2017.
Yeah, June of 2017, yeah. But when I made that, I'm like, I had an audience. As soon as I made that, I had an audience. I'm like, well, if you have an audience, you have to give the audience something. So I just like, okay, well, what do I do? What do I do? I'm like, well, there's that canoe meeting. Where was that canoe meeting? So I'm like, well, where was that? So I found the canoe meeting and I just started talking about that video and I started talking about this video. And then I started going through all the documents and trying to frame and piece the whole story together. So long answer short is that I had been training to tell an impossibly complex story for 15 to 20 years. And then I was given a story to tell. Instead of the written word, I was given video and audio footage to tell this story. So I just changed my medium, but I did the same thing that I had already been doing. And once I started that, I'm like, well, I have to tell the whole thing. I have to tell the whole thing. This is absolutely essential that I tell the whole thing. And while there is certainly bias in my reporting, there's bias in my framing of that, and bias construed as a particular frame of reference and probably a particular interpretation. At least with the complete Evergreen story, I've tried to present it in such a way that allows for multiple interpretations, right? In order to serve not only the progressives, not only the conservatives, but also to serve progressives. So if we have a strong, rational, progressive contingent in my country, I think progress will be much easier to achieve than if we have a ravenous leftist group or progressives that don't really understand that some of their ideas are ripe for, let's use that word again, abuse. Like some of these ideas in progressivism are very easy to abuse. And what causes them to be that way? What allows them to be taken over by narcissistic psychopaths that want to just destroy everything?
So there's some kind of moral aim in the telling of the story as well, is there, or not? This gets into my research into what is a story. Like what is a narrative? Can you have a narrative that doesn't have a meaning? Can you have a story that doesn't have a moral? Can you even tell a story without moral guidance informing you and helping you to organize the material? I think the postmodernists say that it's open to anything. Right. The postmodernist, I'm a postmodernist when it comes to literature, where I go as far as possible to make it mean as many things as possible without it becoming meaningless. I want it to be open to multiple perspectives. I want the exercise. I want to challenge my reader in such a way that by the end of it, they can see things in more than one direction and from more than one angle. Right.
And I probably fail in that because I am personally tied to this story. And especially when I talk about the administration, I have very strong disagreements and very strong opinions about their incompetence and ineptitude and sliminess and lack of backbone, or serpentine backbone with regards to George Bridges. So I do have bias in that respect.
One of the things, actually, when I looked at Evergreen, is the ratio of admin to faculty is very high compared to where I work, for example.
The George Bridges came on. He's the current president. He came on in 2015, and since then he has designed a college that was originally formulated to give as much power and control to the professoriate, and George Bridges has made it more and more top heavy, more and more administration heavy, and done a lot, whether intentionally or not intentionally, to limit the ability for faculty to control the destiny of the college by shutting down communication, by introducing all of these more and more equity officers, more easier for students to complain, and therefore much more difficult for any sort of interesting conversation to happen on the level of the professorate and the student body. Like, you can't venture into certain territories because you might get complained. And Evergreen has coddled an attitude and a culture of seeing a microaggression in everything. They shot themselves in the foot. So another thing that drives me in this is that this is either educational malpractice or malfeasance. Like, what happened at Evergreen, which is a state institution, which is a college, betrayed the spirit and the letter of what it means to be an education institute. They completely betrayed critical thought and inquiry. They betrayed it.
But here's the thing, isn't their aim? Their aim is noble, as it often is in these situations. Like, I just see a lot of people who are talking about privilege and oppression. I know that their ideals are probably good, but it just gets twisted or warped along the way.
Well, I was exploring this yesterday in a live stream because I found another equity document from the American state of Idaho's city of Boyce. The mayor commissioned an equity report, and I went through it line by line, just did a close reading of this equity document. And one thing that I kind of was toying with was the idea of the flaw of the excluded middle. I also call it the progressive lens, which is a metaphor. My glasses are progressive lenses, which means that I can see far up here, right? This attenuates to the far ground, and then this is the close reading, and then there's this middle zone, right? And the middle zone is actually pretty narrow, and then it widens at the bottom for close reading and for the far sighting. And what you see with progressivism, the problem that I see with progressivism is that they can really easily focus on the oppression that's right here and in the past. They really see it really clearly, all the oppression that's going on right now and all the oppression in the past. And they have this huge vision of what society should be, of this utopic world where everybody loves each other. We don't need police officers. We don't need laws anymore. The government can control everything in the best of all possible worlds, right? But that middle ground is where they screw up over and over and over again. And it's like their ideals cannot bridge, or I see constantly this inability to go from the oppressive state to the state of justice and purity. Like, where is that middle ground? And the complexity, this is the problem that I have, is that the problems are so complex that you actually have to break it down into individual determinism. And put more and more power on the individual. I'm an individualist, and I'm aware that has some problems and it's not really feasible, but I think that that's a better way of achieving, let's say, a thriving society, is if everybody has self-determination and self-responsibility, than if the government has that, or the group has that power.
That's one of the points that I came across along the way of between your podcasts and videos. It was about identity politics and how the individual is lost, that then a person is identified or becomes part of the wider group rather than looking at them specifically. Yeah. In Ireland, we haven't had really major incidents. We've had a few little things, but like, are there things that we should be watching out for that we could be going down the wrong track? I actually saw in the place where I work, there is now compulsory bias training, compulsory unconscious bias training, and you cannot be on an interview panel unless you've done this training. So is that like, whoa?
Well, you got to be careful with this stuff. I'm still trying to game ways of doing it. You need to ask, what's the actual studies on this implicit bias training? Has it actually helped anything? I've seen of studies where implicit bias training, privilege training, actually degrades interpersonal connectivity. And if you instead concentrate on increasing everybody's communication skills and ability to interpret and be generous with one another, that actually has a bigger aggregate positive effect than if you go through and pick apart everybody's oppression and privilege, or you start to assign implicit bias to everything. You have to say, okay, this might be a good idea, but what does it actually do? Where does this actually lead? And what's the end goal? And that's another thing that I probably failed to make the point of when I was at these privilege workshops at Evergreens. Like I felt this, like, okay, you guys want to teach compassion. You want to teach love, right? You want to teach these high ideals that actually have been around in Western society for a really long time. They're encoded in this thing called Christianity, and they're encoded in other religions as well. You want to teach the same way, the same things, but you're using all this passive-aggressive, bullshit, statistical, highfalutin language that obscures, like, do you want me to be honest with another person? Do you want me to be charitable to another person? How are you going to teach me to do that by going through these brain-bending, mind-saturating indoctrination camps? You're not going to do it. Furthermore, what you see, you're nominally teaching people to be charitable, let's say. But then in effect, at these privilege workshops, people would shut you up if you're white, if you're a white man. If you quoted a white man, you would say, I know that he's white. I know that this author is white, but he really had some good things to say about privilege. Or like, I know I'm just a white man, but this is my idea. It's like, okay, well, we're already out the gate going backwards, right?
Well, one of the things actually you mentioned about cults and the parallels and the theology and this idea of love was, it was like, I thought it was like, I grew up in a Catholic background. So at Mass, it was like the response to the prayer was amen, or there was different responses, but it was like the response was community love, community love, community love, community love. Yeah. And also this idea of logic and reason is the creation of white people, and therefore it should be just thrown out. It's quite extraordinary that the footage and the ideas.
Yeah. Well, the logic that goes against the logic that dictates that logic is white is actually a white idea. Like white people came up with that idea too, you know? So it's like, okay, you guys can go down that path, but like, are you saying that black people can't do math? Is that what you're saying? Because that's probably the most racist thing that you could possibly do.
I'm conscious of time, and I want to ask you if there's things that you would like to bring up.
Well, what's suitable to your interest? I can tailor myself to your needs.
Jeez, I'm interested in it all. Well, tell us about your interest in the gender. Like 60 of the videos are on gender, sexuality, and transition, interviews. So tell us a little bit about your interest in that area.
This actually ties into my solution to the Evergreen problem. What happened at Evergreen was this erasure of the individual on the level of interpersonal respect and self-respect. And the extremity of shameful behavior of the protesters and of the administration shows to me a lack of accountability, a lack of pride, like real pride in themselves, and real respect for themselves as individuals, and real respect on the level of the administration for authority. The president of the college ceded his authority in these protests and therefore degraded the entire institution. And and all the protesters were acting and behaving on the level of a statistical analysis of historical oppression and not really seeing that the rubber has to meet the road on a person-to-person basis. It has to go there. So looking at getting the racial conversation in America is a very difficult conversation that I don't know if it's ever going to be resolved. However, transgenderism is a pretty new idea, right? Or it was very, very rare, and now it's kind of a hot topic, and it's having a profound effect with regards to childhood development, to medical, psychological care, and to women's rights. It's having a profound effect. And there's a lot of similar rhetoric, activist rhetoric, that is claiming to represent trans individuals that is actually just being co-opted by activists who are saying that they represent trans individuals. So if I want to engage with a topic that has to do with rights or has to do with equality, or what I would rather think of as competing needs, competing rights between, let's say, who gets to use what bathroom, I need to strip the activists of their authority and their centrality in the conversation, because they don't care about anything except for getting their way. They don't care about the truth. They don't care about facts. They don't care about feelings either. They just care about getting their way, right? So what I'm going to do is talk patiently and in an open person-to-person level with individuals who are affected by this, right? And get to know them as individuals first, and allow my audience to get to know these people first and foremost as individuals, then as males with gender dysphoria, or females who detransitioned, or sex researchers with some crazy ideas, or feminists who I even think are kind of crazy too. Some of them, not all of them, you know. And actually embody the evergreen spirit of deeply diving into a topic with incredible inquisitiveness and thorough patience to really get the data, like really act out the positive of the evergreen education, and just completely go overboard and do 100 videos just talking with people about this one little tiny topic, right? And my first and foremost effect is to platform individuals, but my secondary hope is to change the way in which we engage with this issue or these other issues, right? Just make it more sexy to have a good, honest conversation about things that are kind of weird or out there or difficult, you know? Instead of having difficult conversations, have easy conversations about difficult things, right?
Great idea. But I'm guessing, like, gender is probably, is it the most contentious issue at the moment? I don't know. What has been the response like? Have you...
Well, I mean, I limited my you get into something, you get into a topic, and you're going to lose a lot of people in that topic, but you can, I've gained the ability to ask questions of my subjects that apply to people's interests who aren't really interested in the topic, but like kind of get more of a human connection with people. Gender is a very small, you're right, it's a very small topic, but it's not as big as race, right? So it's still a hot topic. And there's a lot of nuances going on with it. But it's more of a what I think of as a human-sized problem. Another problem with activism is that they take on inhumanly big problems, and they fail at interacting with a sense of humility of them not being able to understand the complexity of the issue. I think gender, even though it's a really complex issue, maybe even not that important to a lot of people, it's still small enough for us to get our heads around, and rich enough for us to like see a lot of things going on inside.
Great. Okay. I mean, I could just talk to you for hours, but then I'll have to edit.
Oh yeah.
I'll leave it there. Unless, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
That question fries my brain. I don't know what to say. I mean, I have to be, I can think of anything, but I need to be relevant to you and your audience. So like, you give me a blank check, like I can't even write $1 million on it. Like I just see infinity.
So
sorry.
I will ask you, okay, here's a quick question. I'll ask you one or two quick questions. At the beginning, your channel trailer is great, and it's very fast moving and amusing. But you have, I think, do you have a Tibetan singing bowl?
Do I have?
No. You don't. You don't.
There's a joke there. No,
Right.
there was a joke. There was I was doing a story about a college in Canada where some trans activists went off the rails, and it's about free speech and trans rights. And there was this one document where the word "harmed" was used about 90 times in 3 pages. So I counted how many times they used the word "harm" or "harmed," and I just put that ding. And then after that, like every time the word "harm" comes on my channel, I usually put that. It's like a Pavlovian kind of thing. So it's kind of just a joke that.
Here's another thing. I think I know the answer, but one of the things through the videos was the students clicking their fingers. What's that about?
That's weird. I think this is really weird. I think like so much of what they did, it just doesn't make any sense if you like kind of think about it rationally. But I think originally the snapping stuff was so you don't trigger people with PTSD, because the clapping is too triggering for people who came out of a war zone or a domestic violence situation. So you snap. So they're snapping, but they're screaming obscenities at the same time. So it's like, okay, well.
Yeah, there's a lot of obscenities in it. Not that I mind obscenities, but it was just like out of the blue, "Fuck you, fascist," to the president. Yeah. And he's like, I'm sorry. Yeah. What's your plan for the future?
My future plan? Just create more content. I just want to create content and keep on doing the YouTube is a really interesting thing. I didn't think it really existed, but being in the middle of it, it's like, okay, if you put enough work in there and you play your cards right, you can actually make a decent living off of it. And it's interesting to try to create a living out of politics when I really never was into politics. But so I've been doing a lot of growth and thought about how to interact with political issues in a way that I think is honest and expansive and gives people common ground while also appealing to people so that I can afford to spend the 40 to 60 hours a week that I spend doing this. So just more of the same, but hopefully better and with more interactivity.
Great. Well, I look forward to listening to more. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Colette.
Fantastic.
Hopefully I gave you something to think about or your readers to chew on, and we'll see how right-wing I come across.
Yeah. I'll let you know how right-wing you are.
Let me know. Yeah, let me know when it's up. I'll share it.
Okay, thanks a million. All right, see you, Benjamin. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye. That's the end of this episode of Spokes, with a huge thanks to Benjamin Boyce. If you'd like to hear more from him, you can check out his YouTube channel, which is Benjamin A. Boyce, or his podcast, which is The Boyce of Reason, which is available on all the usual podcast platforms. We'll have more Spokes interviews coming soon.
Please like and subscribe and share the video.
There is no video.
Podcast.
Spokes is